Hello, everyone. Welcome to another post-debate analysis for Debatable Open 2024. As always, I'm Kyle. Nina's not with me tonight because we are currently cramming a bunch of stuff that's related to the tournament. We have in our Zoom room tonight James Cachola, who is our motion contributor for the international relations set. So, hey, James, how are you?
Hi everyone. I'm fine. Really stressed with thesis because we're gonna propose by this May. So that's it. Also kind of nervous for this episode because this is gonna be the first time I'll be appearing in Debatable. Hopefully not the last one as well.
We're sure it won't be the last time that you appear on Debatable, and I'm sure that you're going to do well in this recording, so don't worry about that. So anyway, getting into the first question I want to ask is, international politics as a theme is very daunting for most debaters, especially for novices, and they just so happen to be like our target market for this kind of tournament. So can you give us a bit of insight as to how you can better prepare for these types of themes?
So I think that the first note that debaters have to take in international relations motions is that you have to like not be scared of them in the first place. I think it takes a lot of mental power to really prove something in IR, especially when it's a very matter heavy type of team. So I think that the first preparation that you need to make is mentally. The likely scenario is that these things are something you already knew or have some extent of understanding of. Likely you've heard about them in the news. So you have to prepare yourself mentally first. The second part or the second preparation that you can make is to matter load, like read a lot of things, watch the news, listen to podcasts like Debatable. So the bigger, more complex things becomes easier to understand. And I feel like that helps a lot in the first preparation as well, because it's easier to be calm when entering these types of motions when you know you did your part. And the third preparation, personally, I do this, is to view the actors of international relations as if they're actual people. Tendency is certain actors in actor motions or certain individuals in motions concerning very niche information act in a certain way, likely because of the tendencies of their leaders, of the people in power, or likely because of the culture of the nations that these have.
I think that's really good advice, and that's a really nice transition into our first motion, which is about having a world government. Because you mentioned it was really about imagining yourself in these positions, what are the incentives like? So, for government side, what kind of incentives or changes can you imagine in this kind of world where we welcome the idea of transitioning into a world government?
The main inspiration for this motion is that my current subject, which is political sociology, and we've had this mini debate about like the possibility of a world government. So one of the points made by our professor was how like a lot of the changes that will exist will be viewed under the three perspectives, either structurally, conflictly, or symbolically. And I think that the ways in which the changes will be implemented to some extent will affect the way that local systems work. So I think that laws will be changed to some extent, maybe sovereignty. There might be some degree of changes in terms of territories as well or boundaries, maybe even like fiscal changes in terms of monetary policies. Will there be like a single humanity currency, etc., etc. Maybe migration policies will change as well, make it easier for people to travel. We're no longer divided by borders, but are singled with this one whole government that exists and arbitrates over us all.
Yeah, that's a fair framing. And actually, I wanted to ask you whether in real life, would this be possible to happen in reality?
Yeah, I think I can see a possibility. I can see a future about world government or the transitioning to a world government, given the way globalization works, the exchange of cultures. There are mergers that happen to some degree. Institutions have also adjusted to a more global perspective, especially corporations and businesses, that they're more global by scale, that their marketing works by scale, their products are traded in a global scale. So I think it is a possibility. There are a lot of researches, both quality and quantitative as well, whether individuals prefer this certain possibility or this certain outcome in the future. But I guess it's still really far out in the future.
Okay, so with respect to government side of this debate, what problems are being solved in this kind of world where we have a single administrative authority that has jurisdiction over the entire planet? What problems would that solve?
Well, likely, obviously, the global problems that everyone experiences, like climate change, poverty, maybe even corruption, problems with institutions, peace, and security. So these are problems that I think are easier to handle when you have a streamlined bureaucracy, when there's one authority that dictates everything, and where it's easier to manage and allocate obligation or functions or even resources, primarily because of the way the individual states project and generate their own, and then everyone gets to just like funnel all of that to a one world government, and the state then can reallocate there in areas that it needs the most. So I think that these are issues that are easier, or government can argue is faster in solving if you have an authority that mainly dictates everything in these order, or in specific order, that and in specific order that is cohesive or efficient to some extent.
So of course, government side has to compare it with the current world where you can argue it's less expedient compared to a world with, a single administrative authority. So how do you suggest government teams would go about doing that?
Right. Okay. So I think that this is one of the biggest obligations that government has to do, because it is a characterization that the motion necessitates for the debaters to compare. I think that in terms of the debaters being able to differentiate how this works, maybe it's not only that the bureaucracy changes, but it's also the way people perceive certain problems. So in terms of sovereignty being used to block certain issues being addressed, government can easily highlight the importance of, yeah, government can easily identify the importance of how people will view different things differently if given this new world government. In terms of highlighting certain issues, it becomes faster as well, because the urgency of these global issues are now easier to market or easier to negotiate with individuals that will primarily either be affected by the changes that you will implement, or two, will enact the changes that you want on a grassroots level. So in the aspect of how sovereignty exists now, I think it does get utilized a lot in order to block certain issues, or by certain actors who do gain something from the continuity of these issues. So government can approach that problem by highlighting the change in perspective of people. That also means that they change the way that they decide things, the way they vote for maybe a global president, or the way that they support certain global policies in that specific manner.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So now my next question is, if you were on Gov, how would you imagine teams extending? Because it seems like really, really powerful as a first speaker argument to say that a lot of our problems today can be solved if we have this form of government. So is there any room for extension?
Yeah, actually, the debate or this specific motion is very, very rich, because at first I thought it was supposed to be like a VP type of motion, because you could run so many things. Obviously, from the perspective of international relations, you could run different themes of how religious institutions would approach the shift, or the act of welcoming, of how environmental policies will be crafted in this aspect. In terms of finance and economies, what will the fiscal policy look like? Will exchange rates suddenly disappear in the division of territories? Will we retain the current one, or will there be a new reallocation? Obviously, all of these things will need to be referenced to current geopolitical conditions and national or even regional relationships between states. Three possible extensions that I could think of might be is the principle. The value of welcoming is a humanitarian obligation, maybe because we owe it to ourselves to explore the idea of electing a global leader, or we owe it to post colonies to have a prospective form of reparation, and that the idea of welcoming the transition grants us that introspection, that maybe there is some degree of global cooperation that is needed, and maybe we need to increase it in order to efficiently give back to these victimized nations. That obviously there needs to be a discussion on extents and exclusivity on this specific material, because opposition can easily claim the same benefits from other alternatives. So I think that's the first possible extension, that there's some degree of human obligation to explore the discussion or this specific idea. The second discussion that you might be able to extend on is that maybe welcoming the idea of transitioning highlights the disparity in power and authority that exists internationally. So aside from the pragmatic outcome of having a more efficient bureaucracy, it's under the conflict perspective, the welcoming or the act of welcoming might also be a tool to highlight the disparity in the dynamics and authority that exists internationally, with developing countries serving as peripheral states, providing the raw materials, or like serving as manufacturing economies at the expense of their own environment and resources to supply the demand in like core or the more developed states. So maybe you could say this is under the very basic world systems theory, probably highlight the supply chain to the trading practices of stronger nations in terms of negotiating tariff agreements, etc., etc.
Okay, yeah, those are great arguments. And I think that's very interesting to talk about, right? But I also want to know, how would government side here respond to the idea, for example, that even if we have a unified world under a single world government, there might still be a lot of underdeveloped areas in the same way that, for example, the Philippines is theoretically unified under one national government. There are still many regions in the Philippines that are comparatively underdeveloped. How can you respond to that if you were on government side?
right? So how do you respond to that problem given that the act or the practice itself of unification in smaller versions like nation states still leads to inequality for some regions, right? For some areas, for some territories. I think that government can easily just say that it's all about the timeline. The first part they need to explain is that everything exists by timeline, which means that obviously there will be some areas that won't receive help as fast as we want them to receive that help, primarily because the debate is still about welcoming the idea and not transitioning on it. So they can say that if we do discuss or accept the possibility of transitioning, we can identify how we can approach these regions more efficiently. So government can caveat that the welcoming is an act of first step. So they could rebut that way in proving that eventually these areas will be reached. The second discussion under the same principle of timeline is that most nations or starting entities that are functioning under unification experience these inequalities at first. These are inevitable outcomes from a transition that cannot and aren't called out or are highlighted primarily because of the way these regions were either far in proximity or were amassed by some political dynasty who had corruption or had systematic corruption built within the DNA of that region.
Those are very fascinating discussions, especially on the timeline, because we might have forgotten for a little bit that this is about a transition. So there might be some birthing pains along the way that teams might forget about. So now I want to ask you
Mhm.
about opposition. What do you think opposition should do first and foremost as a matter of strategy in this debate?
So yeah, I think opposition needs to frame the debate first on their favor. Then they could present multiple frames. The first one, maybe they could say the power dynamics of the world is inherently unequal, that there's an imbalance in terms of military strength, in terms of population, in terms of profit generation, in terms of natural resources. And this frame is necessary, and I think it's pretty intuitive for opposition to make, because this launches the possible argument across intercontinental political dynasties that it's no longer national or even locally in your local government units, but some might even exist across regions, across Pacifics, across continents. Another frame that opposition could probably introduce is that there's an existence of MNCs, multinational corporations, and to some extent, they do affect and influence the process of policymaking. Welcoming the idea might lead to corporations monopolizing on the transition phase in order to adjust and scaffold the new world government in their favor so that businesses aren't taxed as much, so that they could occupy certain regions, they could monopolize certain market populations, etc., etc. And probably maybe the final frame for opposition is to say that the state of peace and the degree of democracy in certain areas of the world is inherently unfair or isn't that great, primarily because there's a rise of authoritarian leaders in Asia. You have Duterte and the Marcoses in the Philippines, you have Sue in Myanmar, you also have a lot of other examples of authoritarian leaders that are rising everywhere else in the world. So yeah.
So, building off of those frames, what can you imagine opposition teams will argue here for this debate?
Okay. The first argument that I can think of that OP can launch is a principled one, which is that there's value in having the capacity to retain national identity through sovereignty, that history and the experiences we've had with being led by someone else have always led to territorial annexation or suppression of culture or the deliberate manipulation of institutions to serve the stronger power that is holding us captive or are holding us as hostages. Maybe to some extremes, ethnic cleansing at first, but you would have to cite a lot of examples and provide likelihood in order to prove the frequency of this assertion. That's why maybe opposition can say you cannot open up or welcome the idea of transitioning because it justifies some degree of the manhandling that other nations have done before or are currently doing, because you set the presumption that nations, especially the weaker ones, cannot solely arbitrate on their own. And then you can highlight the tendency for the West to function through their framework of having a white man's responsibility, or the political philosophy that is the terror of the East, and how literature about it have had impacts on foreign policy in the context of migration, in terms of migrant housing or race-specific laws and accommodation. So that banks on the first frame, which is that there's a difference in power dynamics within the world, and that you cannot simply welcome up these types of discussions because it justifies some degree of annexation, because the presumption is someone else needs to take care of you. The second argument probably is that it trivializes the history of annexation, and this is different from the first one because the first one opens up prospective discussions to justify it, but the second one or the second argument coerces people to forget annexation retrospectively, because welcoming the idea would mean setting aside previous historical disputes or experiences, because considering the transition or the idea of transitioning in a world government would have to presume needing to work together as one singular state, which meant likely the adjustments in literature, likely the adjustments in policy, likely having to sacrifice reparations, or a lot of things that we've garnered from the importance of, or from the prioritization of sovereignty and the capacity of states to decide what they want on their own.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting discussion to have, especially with respect to the idea that you are jeopardizing people's national identities. This is a way to justify some level of annexation. Just the idea that we've heard for so long in our history as a colonized state, the idea that if we unite or if we assimilate with a greater culture, it can better us. So that's a really interesting discussion for opposition, I think. But with respect to extension, is there anything that you can suggest that opposition teams might want to look into for the at least the deputy speakers?
Right. I think that the third argument that deputy leader of opposition can extend to is that a best case, worst case of the possibilities from this welcoming or from this act of considering the idea of a world government. They can compare and evaluate and weigh. In the best extent, maybe changes will be made, but that would have to come with certain liberties from certain nations who'd like to differ from or who'd like to retain those liberties, retain those freedom. At the worst extent, they lose their agency. Maybe push it further. Let's say you don't have to sacrifice any liberties at all. Maybe you can retain your Filipino identity. You can still call yourself a Filipino and you still gain something from this one world government. Opposition can then engage on that and explain why that's not a justifiable outcome or why the benefits that you gain, even without the sacrifices, is not a justifiable outcome. Maybe they can extend on the material of having to retain self-sufficiency, that it's precisely because you gain something from this one world government that you'll be completely dependent on it and you lose any capacity to be sustainable, which is important because the world exists interconnectedly. They could also highlight how individuals, especially our leaders, are prone to hyperbolic discounting because they cannot evaluate the gravity of the decisions they make and the long-term effects of it beyond a decade. So maybe deputy leader of opposition can extend on three outcomes. First is the 100% positive material that could happen in Gov. Second would be a 50-50, and then the third might be the worst possibility, that is likely the negative material that might come out from LO. Another material that the LO could extend is their own worst case. Let's say things do not change, things do not improve. Why is that justified? We need to accept that things need to be slow in order to avoid bigger trade-offs and bigger sacrifices in the future.
I think those are great points to make for both sides. And so now I think it's a really good time to transition to the next motion, which is also about some level of unity, because the second motion reads, this House, as social democratic opposition parties in developing states within Asia, would implement a singular political agenda. My first question to you here is what it would mean for different opposition parties in developing states within Asia to implement a singular political agenda. Does this mean like they meet up and then they talk about like, okay, this is our priority for this next election cycle or whatever, or is it something different?
Yeah, definitely. That I think that is one of the characterizations that government would have to explain in explaining or in characterizing what will happen given this or from the creation of this single leftist agenda. Maybe to some extent that would mean for certain versions or yeah, I think to some extent that would mean that for some SOC them parties in different regions to have to sacrifice certain priorities, maybe that would also affect the way that recruitment works in terms of policy making or lobbying certain policies. They would have to readjust and recalibrate their priorities in terms of what other areas in nation, in terms of what other SOCMED parties or counterparts would need in order to have a common ground. Maybe to some extent, it will also affect the degree on retention because some parties or some SOCDEM parties, while they share similar principles, aren't friends with each other. That would also probably mean losing some members to some extent. Another change that they would have to consider is on the degree of preferences towards certain political candidates that will champion their policies in terms of legislation, maybe even champion their proposed projects, their executive preferences that reflects their principles specifically. So there are a lot of changes in terms of the creation of a single leftist agenda that government would have to characterize in order to properly.
So you mentioned some cons already here, like people might leave because they're not always friends with each other. There might be some issues that might be deprioritized. So my next question for Gov is, what can Gov argue to basically say this is all worth it in the end?
Right. So the first argument that government would present is the extent of these SOCMED's multifaceted similarities in principle. So there's a nuance from the SOCDEM element of the motion that necessitates Gov to define. A few of these principles may be democracy, equity, humanism, internationalism, socialist feminism, ecological socialism. And you don't have to be specific, but to some extent, you do need to define that they're pro-labor, Another similarity, in order to justify that in the long run, this is all worth it, is to also explain the degree of struggle that these SOCDEMs have from the frame of close proximity. Likely they face the same authoritarian problem. You could even say maybe it's the same authoritarian leadership because there exists cross-continental. They could say that launching a joint political agenda is mutually beneficial for most of these organizations in terms of resources, because the more successful ones could reallocate given the network that now exists, that is also easier to negotiate and have a bargaining chip over, primarily because we're pushing the same agenda. You also have manpower, even political refuge, maybe for some, because the successful areas have better security for them. So that could be a discussion to prove that in the long run, it's a justifiable sacrifice, because while you lose some members, you could weigh that the ones that do stay can at least survive the retribution that you might face from the authoritarian leadership that you're trying to overhaul, which is harder to defend against when you're functioning individually. Then you can highlight the existence of SOCDEM Asia, the versions that exist in Germany, where they ally with other neighboring countries' versions or counterparts of SOCDEM parties too, that secures better security in the first place.
Yeah, I really like that argument. I actually am familiar with SOCDEM Asia, but I never really connected the dots that it was really SOCDEM Asia. Like I never connected the dots that it was, a unified version of several groups from different countries. That was such a light bulb moment for me. But I guess my next question is, especially for a government, right? Because you already argued this level of security, it can leave them vulnerable for opposition to say that, well, that level of security comes at the cost of some priorities which might be more needed for a particular context. So can you give a defense for government, especially for these states within Asia? Like, what do they have in common, right? That is so compelling that they might be willing to give up some of these priorities.
I think that's a really, really good point, because that's also what I expected from opposition, that there will be differences in priorities because you will have multifaceted differences as well. I think as a defense, government could say that while it leaves you vulnerable from having to sacrifice certain priorities, these priorities can easily be reintegrated or can easily be integrated in the framework, because in the first place, everyone gets to have a say on what the framework should be, on what the agenda should be. But the second level of response that could be, while they might be deprioritized, there are issues that you can still gain or win over, primarily because of the support that you get. But let's say that these issues are the bigger ones in your regions. I think that the only way for government to defend against that is to highlight that these priorities will continue to be a problem if your security is compromised, absent of the support you gain from the network. So I think government could also establish the threat of governments cracking down on these organizations. How in the Philippines, we have the anti-terror law, which is to some extent used to red tag certain organizations. But I think that that security is the ultimate weighing point for government to use as a defense mechanism against this. Maybe you can prioritize these issues, but who will pass the solutions for these issues if you're dead, if your security is compromised, if you cannot actively lobby your bills because you have to prioritize being safe or the safety of your loved ones, etc., etc.
Okay, yeah. So I think now would be a really good time to talk about opposition because you mentioned that like those priorities are okay, like let's do away with them for now in order to secure our own survival. So for opposition, my first question is there a way for opposition to argue that you're actually putting that kind of survival in jeopardy, that it's not even guaranteed that you're going to survive even if you do have a unified leftist agenda?
Yes, definitely, definitely. I think that opposition can argue security isn't assured as well in government, because the act of connecting or having a single political agenda necessitates greater exposure. It's easier to identify which individuals are members of which organizations that are going against which political dynasties, because of the way you need to market yourself in order for these SOCDEM counterparts in other nations to also notice you. Another is, it's also so easy for the state to discredit and prove that you're the enemy of the state, primarily because of the foreign help and foreign aid that you get if you do have a single political agenda, that it's West propaganda that you're pushing, or that it's different Asian countries propaganda that you're trying to reestablish. So in those extents, opposition can make the harm of security symmetric in government, if not proven to be far worse, because of the exposure and the publicity that you'd have to make, or that will happen if you do connect with these types of organizations.
Okay, that's a very fair point. So aside from this, and as also aside from the argument that we talked about earlier, where I pointed out that you might have to give up some of the, you know, pressing issues of that particular place, is there any other thing that opposition can argue here, in your opinion?
Yeah, aside from highlighting the deprioritization of issues, because you'd have to agree and compromise in order to gain that benefit, I think that an extension or another argument that OP could run is the opposite of government, which is that these institutions, these organizations have multifaceted differences in terms of their nature as party, while they share principles to some extent. Maybe they can argue in opposition that in terms of their degree instability of membership, their extent of struggle, while they struggle on the same issues, it might be different. The negotiability of their governments or the capacity of the resources to handle these types of problems, and maybe even the proximity of threat, because some regions face it, some counterparts have them far worse. So all of these metrics are important because it questions the likelihood of the agenda and framework in government's policy of whether it will be sensitive enough and intersectional enough that it applies to everyone else. So it's not only on prioritizing certain issues, but it's also the approaches in lobbying. It's also the degree of whether their governments are negotiable enough, or whether or not some regions and counterparts have the capacity to implement the same policy to the same degree that everyone else expect them to do so. The second argument is just to co-opt the benefits from government and say that if you simply want network, manpower, or resources, you can always have that without trying to alter your agenda as an individual autonomous unit. Opposition will have to prove alternatives. They'd have to prove why the same benefits, if not more of it, will exist on their side too. Finally, maybe the last argument that OP can launch in DLO is that let's say that these benefits are indeed inclusive. I think that finally, the last argument that OP could argue is that let's say that these benefits are indeed exclusive in government. What is the long-termist agenda? How will this single political agenda be readjusted through time? The ways in which these problems might evolve can go multiple ways. So if, let's say, for example, the political agenda will be sensitive and intersectional, that you don't even need to deprioritize certain issues, how will that work in the distant future, given the timeline that it will exist? Because the debate can be current, immediate, and then distant future. That is still a consideration that government has to consider, or that is still a consideration that government has to think of, primarily because aside from this motion being an actor motion, it's primarily also a G debate. So maybe a discussion on timeline to how the agenda will not be capable of adjusting in the different ways that the situations in these regions will change as well in the future.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me, we haven't really discussed like long-termism for government. So is there any way that government side can talk about a long-termist extension?
Yeah, definitely. I think it all boils down to the way government characterizes the mechanism or the policy at hand. They would have to explain how frequent the agenda will have to be changed, maybe even explain or caveat that the process of creating the framework would have to be long-termist as well, or how in terms of the creation, they can also argue that the members who will be creating them won't only be the seniors who will probably not retain or who probably don't have as much retention in terms of membership because they'd have to retire at some point, but it will also include the younger individuals who will take the mantle of responsibility under these organizations. So that's to co-opt the long-termist discussion that opposition might posit as a problem. So it all boils down to how government will mechanize it in terms of membership. How long will we have to change this agenda in terms of how many solutions or how many problems we're able to solve? And to some extent, do we even have the resources to do that? So it is very possible that they can have a long-termist discussion to make sure that this probable and pretty intuitive problem that opposition might raise is preempted as early as prime or as is extended by Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much for that wonderful discussion on the second motion. The last motion that we can talk about is the third motion in the set, which is this House believes that international organizations should cease their non-interventionist policy for territorial disputes concerning repetitive offenders. So this is quite a complex motion, I would say. And I suppose one of the struggles that teams might have in this motion is to talk about what really is the role of international organizations. Because right now, the motion says that they have a non-interventionist policy. For government side, how do you imagine teams would frame this kind of non-interventionist policy?
Okay, that's a wonderful question because I think that in this motion, it requires a lot of framing because of the specific element of time or the frequency element of the motion that specifies simply the repetitive offenders, I think that the first frame that government can launch is that in these scenarios, most diplomatic actions have likely failed already from the notion that it's specifically an intervention for repetitive offenders. So you could say negotiations between these actors have also repetitively failed. Locally arbitrated discourse by these parties have also probably failed. And you can frame that they've had multiple victims from neighboring countries too, most of which are likely members of your organization. So I think that this frame prompts the possible argument that by principle, it is within your obligation to intervene, especially when your members who've consented to participate in your network expects some degree of security from you or some degree of aid in these specific scenarios. So under this framing, they could say it's already a last resort for these types of organizations. We're already at the point where there is an extensive harm from these repetitive institutions or states. The second frame that government could also launch is on the magnitude of the area that is disputed and maybe even the dispute itself or the magnitude of the dispute itself, whether it has caused mass casualties or if it's been a long-standing conflict, etc. So this frame launches the second possible argument, that is that the dispute already has led to harms that directly cross with the incentives of the organization. So this is more as the pragmatic, or this frame is more of the rocket launcher of the second argument, that is the more pragmatic one in the specific motion. And I think that is important for this type of debate because most international organizations are non-interventionist by nature because there's very limited standards to when they can intervene, which is due Korean or peremptory norms universally recognized by the international community, and no derogation of these standards is allowed, which are very, very limited standards that allows organizations to intervene, like slavery, genocide, torture. So under this specific frame, the second one that explains the magnitude of the area that is disputed, they could highlight that the area in of itself or the dispute towards that area has led to maybe genocide or maybe torture because these areas, if they're big in scale, probably promises a lot of natural resources for these repetitive offenders to exploit. Another thing is maybe in terms of the magnitude of the dispute itself, certain parties resulted to torture, to hold the weaker states hostage in order to annex the specific area. So the weaker, far less competitive country cannot occupy that specific region or that disputed territory in the first place. So I think those two framings will work.
Yeah, I really appreciated how you integrated some discussion about the different arguments that you might make. One thing that stands out to me is your discussion about use cogents norms or peremptory norms. So for people who are not familiar, a peremptory norm under international law is basically a standard practice within the international community that you can't just set aside, even for necessity, because there are so many obligations that exist in international law, and most of them, if you have this necessity excuse, you can do away with them, but peremptory norms you can't. And you're completely right that most of them have nothing to do with territories, right? Like it's about slavery, it's about genocide, but there's
Yeah.
another kind of norm under international law that is sort of an obligation that you owe to everyone. And this is what we call an erga omnes norm. So one of the things I was wondering about is there a way for government bench to sort of argue that while this is not a peremptory norm, we should treat, the obligation not to encroach on the territorial sovereignty of another state as an obligation that you just owe to everyone, full stop. Is there a way for you to do that in principle and gov?
Yes, obviously. I think that in this specific scenario, the argument or the material that you could launch under that is that you could probably apply to some degree the social contract to an international degree, that since these members, presumably the victims, have actively consented to participate in your network or in your organization, there's a degree of obligation that the organization needs to give back towards, or to allow aid to enter and to allow intervention to occur. The second possible angle is simply to argue that these territorial disputes lead to these standards eventually, or lead to these outcomes such as genocide or torture. The third possible way that you could probably approach this is to say that in terms of these international organizations' survival as well, the only way for it to continue being a credible organization is if it's able to actively allow its members to feel its presence And maybe to some extent, that's where the intervention becomes justified because absent of any aid whatsoever, or maybe intervention towards the repetitive offenders, the organization loses credibility, the organization loses the trust of their members because what is the point of staying when we don't get anything whatsoever in the times where we need it the most?
Government can argue this will deter repeat offenders from encroaching on other states' territories, right? Because they stand to lose a lot. But my question is that really true for government? Like, is there a way to prove that? Because one of the recurring criticisms against international law is that it really doesn't have any teeth. So, is there a way for government teams to sort of paint a picture that these international organizations do actually have a lot of bargaining power at play?
Yeah, definitely. The conflicted nations will be under certain unions, members of regional coalitions that serve specific functions, most of which are for networking, for trade, and security. And I think that given this difference in functions, the international organization have different and various ways to implement intervention as well. If you're an economic bloc, you could probably implement interventions in terms of the amount of goods that they're allowed to trade, in terms of the quota, in terms of the amount of tariffs they'd have to pay in the countries that they've wronged. If you're an organization that specifies on aid, like UN, maybe you could probably allow more resources that is allocated in these weaker, far less advanced countries. Maybe to some extent, allow more intervention in terms of anti-corruption policies so the weaker states can have a fighting chance against these repetitive offenders. And let's say, for example, ICC. I think that the only time that ICC do get to be able to intervene is when both parties consent to the jurisdiction of the ICC. So I think maybe judicial and legal repercussions might be implemented in terms of migration. So you don't allow people, or you don't allow the officers of this specific state to transfer to the neighboring countries that they've wronged or whose territories they've annexed. So I think that the tieback is multiple organizations have specified functions and operations, and to some extent, there will be a capacity for them to implement the specific expertise that their network is operating on in order to have sanctions and interventions either against the repetitive offender or in favor of the territory or of the country whose territory is being annexed.
Okay, that's great. So now we can move on to opposition because I think that's a really compelling case for government. Now I'm curious, how would opposition evolve and step up to this challenge? How can opposition respond to this essentially? Like, I can imagine that the struggle for opposition here is, okay, if they don't do this, what will happen? Like, are we just gonna let them do whatever it is that they're doing? So what would be the counterfactual that opposition can defend here?
Right. So I think that opposition essentially in this debate need to choose between two possible cases. The first one is that I don't want to label it as the more hardline case or the more hardline material because it still depends on how the debaters will execute the analysis behind this material. So opposition would have to choose between the first one, which is that there's no intervention whatsoever. The second case, and it's not really a soft case because again, it all boils down to the way the debaters will execute them, is a more extreme version of government's policy, which is that international organizations should intervene even in the cases of first-time offenders. So those are, for me, two possible interesting cases that teams could run. So different rooms might have different debates. But I think essentially, in order to prove the first one, which is that no intervention whatsoever is justified, opposition first have to frame the timeline of these disputes, that to say that most of them happen pretty recent, that diplomacy might still be an option between these two parties, which prompts two possible arguments. The first one is that most interventions have led to peace and security that have solved these problems absent of the intervention of the international organization. So they'd have to indicate a lot of examples of that in the real world to contextualize and prove the frequency that diplomacy is still effective. But two, they can also highlight that most previous interventions have led to bad outcomes, that it worsened the problem because the moment the third party stepped in, there was more aggression from the repetitive offender, more people died because of their actions, etc., etc. So that's a first discussion on the first possible case that an opposition would run, which is there shouldn't be an intervention at all. So that's very important because if you frame this, or that's very important because it all boils down to whether opposition can frame the timeline of these problems, if they're recent enough, or if even if they've been a long-standing issue, how will these two arguments work under that specific frame? The second one is that international organizations should intervene even in cases of first-time offenders. I think it's a pretty interesting one to explore because it's not as expected. To some extent, some debaters might feel like it's squirreling around the motion requests of you to defend. But essentially, I think it's still a valid opposition case to run because it's still going against what the policy is from government, which is that it only applies to repetitive offenders. So under this, I think that opposition would have to frame would yeah under this, I think while it sounds kind of tricky or kind of sneaky, for example, I think that it's quite strategic as a case because it co-ops and functions well under the frame that government establishes, which is to say that in these scenarios, diplomatic actions have failed. It's likely a last resort. It's an outcome of repetitive offenders not being sanctioned to some extent. So opposition could say, well, if you just want sanctioning and you think these actors are bad, you can always argue a more extreme version of the policy. So obviously, government can then respond that, well, like that cannot be the case because if you're going to sanction first-time offenders, you're unsure whether there's patterns of behavior and a history towards this specific behavior, or if it's only an outcome of the current administration. But then again, at this point, government might have a problem because there will be specific contradictions that they need to really, really walk around in order to not sound contradictory or in order to ensure consistency in their case line.
So you mentioned two very different strategies for how opposition can go about this. Let's talk about the first one first, which is just a strategy that let's not do any intervention at all because it'll make things worse in the timeline that there'll be more aggression. Here, I want to ask, can opposition also argue that if we do this, won't states just not join or will they be likely to withdraw from the international organization? If so, how do opposition teams mechanize that? How do they prove that? And secondly, assuming that they do mechanize it, why would it be uniquely harmful for everyone involved if they do that?
Right. I think that in order to avoid the problem of losing membership, opposition has to explain the benefits that states have already gained and garnered from the network and from the participation and membership that they have within these organizations. So So opposition will do a lot of legwork in terms of proving the likelihood of these institutions and nations still staying even with zero intervention at all. But number two, I think that the way they could mechanize that, aside from highlighting the benefits they've garnered, is simply to improve the ways in which benefit from that organization, maybe connecting them with more network, with more allies, with more allies and more trading partners, so they can get something in return enough for them to stay, even if you're not directly helping them, because you're connecting them with people that can justifiably aid them in that specific dispute. So that's one way to those are two ways to mechanize the retention. As an impact, opposition could easily argue not only retention of membership, but acquiring more membership in general, because in the process of not intervening, it's also a marketing strategy to allow other states to see that you can be trusted because you don't try to arbitrate their politics for them or their foreign disputes for them in the first place. But secondly, I think that as an impact, these types of nations who aren't members yet are also easily enticed when you're the one directly connecting them and not just allowing them to trade with each other. To some extent, it will sound contradictory to the first part, but it's all about the application of where you're applying your expertise and functions as an organization, that you're redirecting them and also enticing other states to join your organization by not arbitrating their own disputes. So as a third impact, the weaker states in these disputes will have greater capacity to defend themselves, maybe because of the ROI that they garnered from new trading partners, maybe because their social mobility is better from the investment of foreign trade, maybe because to some extent the repetitive offender is now scared of trying to continue the dispute or the conflict in the first place, because now there are more people at stake given the ways their political and territorial behavior will affect the ways in which other states will see them, assuming that the weaker states now gains more allies as well.
Okay, so I want to briefly go back to the second strategy that you mentioned for opposition, which is instead of intervening for repeat offenders, let's start intervening immediately, even without repetition. So my question here is there any way to extend for opposition if this was the strategy, because while I do get that you're able to co-opt a lot of the arguments coming from government, is there any more room to expound on this? Like, is there a unique benefit to argue that you should intervene immediately, especially in light of what you were talking about earlier, where if it's too interventionist, no one will want to join it.
Right. I think OP can expand on the deterrence that it does, on how it sets a precedence to other nations who have an interest to annex certain regions. I think that it also changes the way we perceive the international community because, yeah, as you've stated a while ago, it's often perceived to have no teeth at all. So I think opposition can run this specific discussion in order to have more flexible material. But at the same time, I think a possible unique extension for DLO would be that it changes the way people perceive international organizations. And to some extent, maybe, I think opposition can also argue to some extent, maybe provide them with more trust and security. Because while these organizations do intervene, it's only when there are areas in regions that are being taken away, that are annexed by certain parties.
I think as a final question that I have for this motion, if government side can't rebut to that strategy by saying, oh, that's too much intervention, how then would government respond to the strategy from opposition?
I think this is where I think there are multiple ways to respond to that. I am excited to what the response will be from the debates that I'll also be judging in Debatable. But I think one that I could think of is that it's the response shouldn't be that, well, that's too much intervention. But I think it's all about understanding the capacity of these organizations. Maybe the reason why we only intervene at the last possible moment is because if we try to intervene in this multiple territorial disputes with multiple repetitive offenders, you literally have so many individuals you need to take care of. You have Israel and Palestine. You also have Russia and Ukraine. You also have China versus Taiwan and the Philippines. You also have South Sudan versus Sudan. And of course, the never-ending territorial disputes in Africa. So I think as a response, something that I could think of at the top of my head is that government can launch whether or not the capacity of these organizations allows them and grants them the efficacy to simultaneously intervene in these areas with the same degree of help and aid. Because if opposition do run the second case, which is that we should intervene the first time, I think that territorial disputes in general are unavoidable situations in the sphere of international relations, primarily because of resource incentives, because of difference in history, in the way that nations and certain countries explain and record their borders, for example, given that we don't have as much, given that these nations constantly change in terms of administration, constantly change in terms of the people handling these recordings in the first place. So I think that opposition needs to prove that capacity in order to successfully defend this case.
Okay, that's all that I have for this particular motion and for this post-debate analysis. Thank you so much, James, for your thoughts. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, especially when you're talking about those theories that I'm not really super familiar with, like, threat from the east and stuff like that. Those are definitely things that I will research more about on my own. And I also hope that to anyone who's listening, I also hope that you were also inspired to learn more about these topics moving forward. So thank you so much, James. Yeah, thank
You,
you so much.
thank you so
And
much.
and that's it for this post-debate analysis. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.